discusses how to be a racial justice ally. While many people want to help in the ongoing struggle for equality and equity, it is important to learn what to do and when to do it.
Because this topic is crucial to our work in society, we're going to talk about how we can all show up as supporters and stand up as allies. As educators, we're faced with tough choices every day for how we support our students when their lives and experiences are different from our own. We watch the news, surf social media, and talk to our friends and families about social justice issues, disparities, protests, and how the larger society may affect our own lives.
For students of color, these issues are real. They're lived every day, and they are life-changing. People of color are facing impossible odds, and they need allies who will not only provide moral support, but who will actively fight injustice in a variety of ways. One of our nation's former First Ladies said it best, "For it isn't enough to talk about peace, one must believe in it. And it isn't enough to believe in it, one must work at it."
A good place to start is to define racial justice, or what it means to say that we need racial justice for all. According to a website titled Racial Equity Tools, racial justice is the proactive reinforcement of policies, practices, attitudes, and actions that produce equitable power, access, opportunities, treatment, impacts, and outcomes for all.
Racial justice, or racial equity, goes beyond anti-racism. It's not just the absence of discrimination and inequities, but also the presence of deliberate systems and supports to achieve and sustain racial equity through proactive and preventative measures. To achieve this takes effort on the part of all who believe in its value.
Before we go further, we need to define the term whiteness. In a racially just society, there are two necessary actions we all must take. First, we have a civic responsibility to stand shoulder to shoulder with all people, and second, we must respect each other's differences. By completing these actions, we strive as a community to integrate all people to believe in one another, respect one another, and lift each other up.
We began this module by talking about being a racial justice ally. So what is an ally? Let's break it down. An ally is one who actively works across racial lines to break down barriers to equity and dismantle systemic oppression.
In the words of Leanne Bell, racial allies work toward a common vision of society in which the distribution of resources is equitable and all members are physically and psychologically safe and secure. As allies, we recognize our privilege and understand that it is in the interest of all humans and society to invest in eliminating our own complicity in systemic racism and oppression.
Jonathan Osler makes this definition concrete. An ally is like a disruptor and educator in spaces dominated by whiteness. An ally might find themselves at a social gathering in which something inappropriate is being talked about. Instead of allowing that space to incubate whiteness, the ally wisely disrupts the conversation and takes the opportunity to educate those present. Allies constantly educate themselves and do not take breaks. A recently coined word, allyship, refers to the purposeful action one takes to promote racial justice. Allyship starts by first looking inward and acknowledging your own privilege and position of power. Everyone has privilege. If you are white and you are a man, you have the most opportunity for privilege.
Those of us who have privilege receive unintended benefits that likely go unrecognized. And a part of being a racial justice ally involves pointing out these privileges, not in a hostile manner or as a manner of negating anyone's accomplishments. Rather, speaking out is for the purpose of recognition, which is a key first step to dismantling inequity. When we say that privilege is unearned, it does not mean that one has not earned what they have, only that it must be recognized that the challenges and barriers to achieving anything in life are not equal for all of us. We don't share the same life experiences.
For example, if you are a person of color, your heart starts to beat just a little bit faster when a police car pulls in behind you. Will you make it home safely, or will you become another statistic? Will you have a positive interaction, Or will you be the next individual whose name is said as a social justice rallying cry? White people worry less than people of color that they will become an international symbol of injustice from a simple interaction with the police. Another facet of allyship comes from being in a position of power. What positions of power do you currently hold? Are you a teacher with power over your students to determine what lessons they have to complete to earn grades? Are you an administrator who determines the level of consequences for students? Are you a security guard who decides when to escalate or de-escalate a situation? Are you a custodian who chooses which classrooms get lots of attention and which ones only get their trash taken out? Are you a clerk who determines which parents get served first when there are several in line at the office desk? Are you a bus driver who assigns seats to all of the students riding on your bus? Are you a coach who has opportunities to teach fairness and equity on the field? Are you a parent who has chosen to raise your children in a neighborhood with folks who are only of the same race as you?
According to Dr. John Rabel, when in a position of power, a racial justice ally will ask oneself the following questions. Do I demonstrate knowledge and awareness of the issues of racism? Do I continually educate myself about racism and multicultural issues? Do I recognize my own limitations in doing anti-racist work? Do I raise issues about racism over and over, both in public and in private? Do I realize it's not about me and avoid personalizing racial issues as they are raised in conversation? Can I identify racism as it is happening? Do I rely on people of color for education about my own and institutional racism? Do I wait for people of color to raise white people's awareness? Do I strive to share power, especially with people from marginalized groups?
Think about your own positions of authority and how you use your power to educate and empower others. It is important to leverage those positions to stamp out racism and inequities, to level the playing field for all people.
There is an insightful quote that says, "If doing what was right was always easy, we would always do what was right." Standing up for social justice isn't always easy, but it is always right. It can be uncomfortable to confront the beliefs and actions of others that are different from our own. However, this important work can no longer be ignored.
Our students and families deserve for educational leaders to focus their time, attention, and energy on this topic right now. We can't just wait for things to get better tomorrow. Regardless of your exact position, you are one of our educational leaders. Because as educators, whether you drive a bus, work in the office, or teach math, you have a position of authority over the students.
I think from an educator standpoint, we have a responsibility with the conversations that we have with our students and young people about things that are happening, right now in our society. A lot of things that we see as a microcosm of, things that have been going on for, a very, very long time. But you have, people that, due to different varying reasons are more likely want to speak out and talk about things, whether that's in a positive way or a negative way. And, as someone that, teaches smaller kids, at the elementary level, a lot of our students are exposed to different things at an early age. And the one issue can be misinformation that they may or may not receive, whether that's from social media, whether that's from conversations that they have with each other, or family members or extended individuals to them. And so I think sometimes we do a disservice because kids are exposed to different things and they hear these things, but they're maybe not being taught what does this mean? And so they're being left to their own devices to try to come up with, how should I respond to that?
But if something is a reality, you can't let systemic racism stop you from telling the truth, right? Like if this is a reality, right, we can't be afraid to upset people who deny that this is a reality, because it is. So we just have to sort of go, where the truth is, and then deal with the consequences as it comes up.
But on the teacher level, like I saw my coworkers, like how they truly feel or how they truly don't feel, I guess, because of their lack of response, was equally as hurtful. But then to also think about, like they go and teach Black children or Black and brown children, they go and teach all children, but you feel this way or you don't feel compelled to say anything or do anything, which to me at this point is equally, if not more, upsetting that you don't see anything wrong to say anything. So it was also hurtful to like see that in my coworkers and to know that they're not going to get fired. Like really, in all honesty, they're going to have those feelings and to continue to do that and not make changes in their classroom, which was even more frustrating. But yeah.
I think that kids recognize power in things that we talk about. So when we don't talk about certain things, there's not power there for the student or for the child. So to give power to something, we need to talk about it and own it.
We bring those conversations the way that we bring any conversation in. We educate ourselves and we then educate the kids. We look at what's going on outside in the world, and we find literature, we find lessons that can teach our students all about this, no matter what race they are, about all of these things that are affecting all of us. You know, race is not necessarily just a Black issue, it's an American issue.
Because we all experience frustration when we hear others express opinions that are different from our own, as racial justice allies, we must be strategic in our approaches to confronting others. Here are some considerations for helping these confrontations and conversations be constructive. As educators, we must take a stand in defense of all of our students. It's not okay to be silent in the fight for equality and equity, and your students deserve your allyship. But being a racial justice ally is more than just shouting people down. We must consider how to strategically confront unrecognized privilege, inequity, and oppression.
When confronting these persons, remember that logic trumps emotion. The purpose is not to dominate, it's to enlighten. Speak the truth in a straightforward and logical manner. Remember, you are an educator, so think of this as a teachable moment.
Most often, the point is not to change an individual's behavior. Rather, it is to speak a truth and logic that will sink in, both for an individual and whoever else may be listening.
This can definitely be uncomfortable, but remember, it's not personal. Your comments are simply statements of fact that are offered for the perspective of others. In addition to remaining calm and logical when confronting others' privilege or racism, understanding the language and logic is crucial. Thus, we must educate ourselves.
It's easier to maintain a calm demeanor when simply presenting facts. The best comeback for a racist comment or irrational belief is to cite research and figures. It's hard for those who are ignorant to argue against this. When facing others and seizing those opportunities, choose wisely when to take a stand. First, you must educate yourself on terms and appropriate language so you can combat those who want to deny, minimize, or justify racist language, beliefs, or actions.
Again, it's important to remember that your voice is not alone, and every voice is important. As Anita Kotick said, if you think you're too small to have an impact, try going to bed with a mosquito in the room.
This year's gonna be rough.
Oh, yeah.
Lots of Black kids coming from downtown, and you know they have problems with reading because they come from the
Well,
projects.
there's going to be so many behavior problems this year. Particularly, these kids are up all night. There's so much gang violence.
Not all the kids that come from downtown are Black, and not all the kids that come from downtown are going to have
We're
reading or
not
behavior issues.
saying all. Kids from that environment are worse off, and we have to deal with the problems they bring.
Actually, I've done the research, and it says that these students are no more likely to have problems than any other kids. Now, the problems, they come up because we expect them to have problems, and that's just a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Wait.
Trust me, I've worked in these neighborhoods, and I promise you, these kids have problems.
Well, sure, I'm not saying there's not going to be any problems, just that they aren't any more likely to have problems than any other kids, and they are going to live up or down to our expectations. Now, me personally, I'm going to welcome all my new students with the expectation that they can succeed as long as I give them strong instruction and support.
Yes, of course.
In other modules, we've addressed the topic of microaggressions, but as review, microaggressions are actions that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults to people of color. They include microassaults, micro-insults, and micro-invalidations.
Dr. Daryl Wing Sue puts it very well. Microaggressions are the everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group membership.
Think back to the analogy of the mosquito in your bedroom. Microaggressions may seem small, but their constant presence and irritation accumulate to cause larger racial trauma. Even well-meaning teachers might engage in microaggressions as part of an inherent or implicit bias.
Implicit bias is an important concept of which we must all be aware because it affects us all.
But I think some of it's leadership too. We have some strong leaders that are very willing to open up the table and let's have these discussions, and we've always come from the mindset of when you need to stop and you need to focus on your community and your classroom and build that community, then you stop. Because you're not going to get anywhere with this content if you don't have that built. So I think that comes from training of leadership too. And you know, when I say training, I think one of the things we continue to say here is it is not a check mark in a box. Like I feel like some of what I've heard is, well, we did that racial equity training and we did that implicit bias training, so check, we're done. That's not what it is. Like you've got to keep teaching it and talking and working on it. And you had mentioned being intentional about it, and that's where I think it's not because you're a bad leader or you're a bad teacher. You have to be open and you have to be taught.
I think also holding people accountable is really what, maybe this is just my personal journey this year, is that sometimes I don't have to do everybody else's job within this like realm of equity and race, especially as one of the like few Black teachers in the building, that like I still have the agency and the power to like hold my administration and my bosses accountable to doing the work for our students. Like at the end of the day, that's what is most important. So pushing them to, well, not pushing them, but getting them to be uncomfortable and holding them accountable to doing, you know, their part of the work while I do my part of the work, and then our kids do their part of the work, and then parents do their part of work. But just finding power in like holding people accountable to doing, you know, their part.
To say that someone has an implicit bias means that they've developed expectations of others' behaviors, attitudes, or personality characteristics based solely on some superficial characteristic. To say that the bias is implicit means that it is not something we even realize most of the time. But this is more than simple stereotyping because it affects the manner in which we approach, interact with, and perceive the behaviors of others.
All humans have implicit bias. We perceive the world around us and use it to predict what's safe and what's dangerous. But when considering people, media representations and stereotypes create irrational and unconscious expectations of those who are different than us. When we're around diverse people on a regular basis, working and sharing personal interactions, these biases are less likely to be as impactful.
For example, let's say that I've had bad experiences with students wearing hoodies from students of all races and genders. While I don't tell myself that hoodies are bad or try to treat them differently, I do tend to keep an eye on those students more. That's the implicit bias. I expect those students to have more problems, so I'm more aware of their actions. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Implicit bias doesn't mean that we are necessarily mean to these students, but the simple fact that we're watching them more closely leads us to find problems. If you watch any person closely enough looking for problems, you'll find a problem. And as we address those students' problems, they end up being the target of more negative interactions, even though their behaviors weren't any different than others in the room. Research has repeatedly shown that African American males receive more negative interactions from teachers, even when controlling for behavior. And this is the case regardless of the race or gender of the teacher.
The reality is, race is not a predictor for student behavior. Consider this data from observations of classrooms in 60 JCPS schools. Note that at every level, white and non-white students do not differ in their rates of disruption or levels of on or off task. The fact that many of us still believe that non-white students are more likely to misbehave is an example of implicit bias. Again, it's not intentional bias, but whether intentional or not, the outcomes of this bias are dire for students of color. One might reasonably ask about implicit bias, but what if I'm right? What if those students do have more problems?
Regardless of whether the bias is accurate, simply watching for misbehavior and reacting to it does not predict more positive outcomes. Our logical response to this question is, what can we do to promote equity in the classroom? Or what can we do to maximize the probability of success for all students?
Once we recognize and own our bias, we can actively work to combat it. Let's go back to those students with hoodies described earlier. Once I realize that I have a tendency to watch these students with the expectation of problems, I can use that realization to create more success. In other words, what actions can I take for the students with hoodies to prevent whatever problems I might have predicted? I might meet them at the door and make a personal connection.
Once we recognize our implicit bias, we might also provide additional prompts to the entire class. Consider ways to engage students during instruction, and look for and acknowledge positive behaviors. We have the power to create positive behavior before it turns negative. And it's very clear, positive behavior begets positive behavior. It's our role to create the circumstances that will begin this cycle.
In summary, we all have implicit bias. It's natural, but often invalid or inaccurate. The key is in whether we recognize our own biases, own them, and are purposeful in our actions to create positive prevention.
So we've just talked about how to overcome negative outcomes associated with implicit bias by using positive prevention in the classroom. Let's turn now to other more global strategies for being a racial justice ally. As a big idea, we need to think and act strategically as opposed to randomly.
Part of being an ally is being an activist who promotes social change. An activist is anyone who's fighting for change in society. Activism means you feel strongly about a cause and are working towards a change.
Social activism is intentional action to bring about social change. When you intentionally do social action work, you are galvanizing others to meet the goal of social justice.
Protesting for social justice is to stand up against oppression and show up in places that disrupt the status quo. To protest is to actively push back against society's definition of how things should be for all. Some protesters physically march and come together with others in unity to display their disapproval of how society treats people in certain situations.
But social activism is more than just protesting. What stores you patronize, what products you buy, what stations or programs you watch, or even which cities or countries you travel to are all decisions that can affect change. Protesting is the act of showing objections to injustice. While protesting is a great way to show your support for a social justice cause, it is not the only way to affect change in our society. As Americans, we have the right to vote, and our vote is our voice. It's important to hear and understand candidates' positions on issues of social justice and rights for all.
Some protesters physically march and come together in unity to display their disapproval of how society treats people in certain situations. As a teacher, use your classroom as an opportunity to engage in mock debates and voting opportunities. Allow students to explore the judicial system and learn why it is important to have your voices heard through the power of voting.
As a parent, include your children when watching political debates, then discuss the issues. As a mentor, give kids the opportunity to see the political process in action by taking them to a rally. The earlier we learn how to use our political voices for social justice, the earlier we can educate others around us.
Remember, voting is power, and power affects change. Another way to be strategic is to work to educate others through social media posts, small group and one-on-one discussions, or even writing an op-ed for the local newspaper or your favorite magazine. All of these are ways to teach others about the injustices people of color face on a daily basis.
Allowing your students to have discussions in the classroom and to use everyday class assignments to research and learn about unequal practices is a part of activism. Let's talk a bit more about what it means to be an advocate for social change. In the words of Robert F. Kennedy, each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance.
When you're an advocate for social justice, you are the catalyst for change in others, including your family, friends, coworkers, and bystanders. Advocates publicly show support for the things they think are important. Allies are not bystanders, but are champions of social justice, willing to be a lone voice in a sea of dissent. Use the power of your voice to show others what courage looks like in action, and empower others.
Empowerment means to lift others up. When you are in a position of authority, be strategic and be intentional about giving leadership opportunities to people of color and those of different genders and backgrounds. Sometimes people just need the opportunity to show what they know.
When given the space to shine, stars often do. Being a racial justice ally is not without risks, and we all take risks from time to time, whether it's trying a new recipe out on your family, teaching a new grade level or content that you're unfamiliar with, taking a road trip without a map, or going on a skydiving adventure. We take the risks if the reason is important to us. It can be scary and difficult to think about the unknown when tackling racial injustice. It may make you feel like you're inadequate, indecisive, lack self-confidence, or bring fear that you will make a mistake.
As allies, we must intervene when we see situations where racism is implicitly or explicitly being shown to people of color. Ultimately, it's the healthy, moral, and ethical thing to do. And this brings us to another point in being strategic. While it may seem important to take your newfound confidence and empowerment to grapple with every act of social and racial injustice that comes your way, remember, be strategic. The war is bigger than the battle. You may not win every debate or even change the hearts, minds, and actions of all of your friends, family members, and coworkers. But one of the predominant purposes of declaring and promoting allyship is showing others where you stand.
When you're an ally, you don't stay silent when you face injustice or see others facing racism. You teach your friends, family, and coworkers that have no tolerance for ignorance or blindness to stand against the issue of social injustice.
Imagine a world where all people feel they are equitably treated, where we don't have to worry about interactions with the police, or even interactions with sales clerks when walking through a department store. Imagine a world where our students feel safe, respected, supported, and heard by all teachers and adults in their lives. Former First Lady Michelle Obama states, "Race and racism is a reality that so many of us grow up learning to just deal with. But if we ever hope to move past it, it can't just be on the people of color to deal with it. It's up to all of us, black, white, everyone, no matter how well-meaning we think we might be, to do the honest, uncomfortable work of rooting it out." We all have the responsibility to move this work forward. Racial injustice ends with you.
As we reflect on how to be a racial justice ally, consider the words of author and poet Mana Tonquit. It is clear that the way to heal society of its violence and lack of love is to replace the pyramid of domination with the circle of equality and respect. Now, let's take a look at some examples of people strategically taking the role of an active racial justice ally.
I am still struggling to get through to my black kids. I mean, You come from that neighborhood and you are not ghetto. Do you think that you could talk to them for me?
You know, the term ghetto is racist. It infers that people living in the same area are all the same. Not all people living downtown are the same. I mean, you and I, we think very differently, and we live in the same part of town.
I think when he says ghetto, he's just referring to downtown. He's not racist.
I'm not saying he's racist. I'm saying that it's a racially loaded term. I mean, it's not used to describe poor white kids in neighborhoods or white neighborhoods with low social economics. We need to be careful about how we talk about people. I mean, words can be hurtful and racist, even if we don't intend them to be.
Remember, white people don't all speak for all white people, and black people do not speak for all black people. This is a common microaggression and deserves a response from an ally.
Watch how this ally handles another microaggression.
Oh, Mrs. Smith is so nasty and has such a bad attitude every time I call her about her son's tardiness. And she sounds like she just rolled out of bed and it's almost 10 o'clock. No wonder her kid can't get to school. She can't even get herself together. And every time that she drags herself up here to talk to the principal, she's wearing one of those do-rags or scarf or whatever the thing is that on the top of their head that they call it. I mean, have a little self-respect.
Not everyone's circumstances and history are the same. I mean, many of our parents work late hours
And they rely on the older kids to get the younger kids to school on time.
Well, sure, I know
think
that.
she should be admired for wanting to do the best for her son.
And in actuality, her headdress is actually very cute and stylish, and just because it's not something you'd wear doesn't mean it's less appropriate.
Well, she doesn't have to have such a bad attitude when I'm just trying to do my job.
You know, I'd be angry with you if you assumed something about me that wasn't true. I believe that we should show people respect in order to deserve respect from others.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right.
We can't know what others go through, and we can't judge what's appropriate for others. We must realize that we each have our own challenges and ideas about what is and is not important.
Watch how this episode of Implicit Bias is handled by a racial justice ally.
Throughout my career, I've noticed that kids that come from the neighborhood just can't quite pay attention. And I can see them coming, and I'll keep an eye out because as soon as they get off task, I'll jump right on it. And if you pay attention to them, you'll notice that all of them are off task and need to be redirected.
Oh, yes. You know, I've seen the same thing, and those same kids will pull out their phones. So I keep an eye on them, and as soon as that phone comes out, I take it away. You have to be alert to nip it in the bud.
Yep.
You know, if you watch for a problem with a kid, you're probably gonna find it. I mean, kids will pull out their phone or be off task, you'll eventually see it. And it makes you believe that your hunch is right.
Yeah, but those kids seem to have more problems than the other students.
In reality, there's no way to compare a group of students to another group of students. I mean, all kids have their phones out. In our faculty meetings, we're not supposed to have our phones out, yet some of us look at it from time to time. If someone was watching us, they think we have a phone problem in our meetings.
Glancing at my phone during a faculty meeting isn't an issue.
But if the rule is not to have your phone out, then you're breaking the rule. My point is that if we believe a student will have a problem, we ought to take the necessary actions to prevent it from happening.
We can't expect to prevent every problem a kid might have.
Clearly not, but if we thought a kid might have errors with a math problem, it's up to us to provide more instruction or provide more prompts to ensure their success. Just waiting for the failure and jumping on it doesn't increase the chances for success in the future. I think believing that a student may have some problem with behavior is an opportunity for me to create circumstances in which they can achieve something.
This teacher provided a logical response to other teachers' descriptions of problems that were clearly the result of implicit bias. In this module, we've talked about what it means to be a racial justice ally. Remember, being an ally means being strategic. It's not enough to sit back and wait for an opportunity. Rather, we must be an advocate and take risks to educate others, to empower people of color.
Clearly, each of us is but a single voice, a single actor in the quest for racial justice. But remember, change starts with a single action, and each of us working as an ally to speak out against inequity and oppression to positively affect the lives of all people. Our solitary actions will lead to monumental shifts and changes in society that will create racial justice for all.